Moonlight washes over a field of silent stone markers in ancient Carthage. Each one guards a small clay urn buried in the earth, and inside each urn lie the charred bones of an infant. For centuries, these grim finds have fueled one of history's most disturbing questions. Did the Phoenicians, the brilliant inventors of the alphabet and masters of the Mediterranean Sea, really sacrifice their own children to the gods? This is a mystery wrapped in ancient propaganda, shocking archaeology, and modern academic war. By the end, you will have the tools to weigh the evidence yourself and decide if the legend of blood on the altar is a dark truth or a monstrous lie. We will sift through enemy accusations, examine tiny bones with forensic science, and confront why some scholars now fiercely deny the entire story. What does it truly mean when we say a civilization was capable of such an act? These silent stones lie in the shadow of a civilization that once lit up the ancient world. To understand the weight of the accusation against them, we must first see the Phoenicians not as monsters, but as they truly were, brilliant architects of the classical age. They emerged from the narrow coastal strip of the Levant, a land of cedar forests and rocky harbors in what is now Lebanon and Syria. They were not conquerors of vast empires, but something perhaps more enduring, masters of the sea and the marketplace. Their ships, crafted from the famed cedars of Lebanon, were the most advanced of their time, vessels of trade and exploration that turned the Mediterranean into a Phoenician highway. They were the great connectors of the ancient world. A Phoenician merchant might unload fine Tyrian purple dye, a color so rare it was worth its weight in silver, on the docks of Egypt one month, and barter for Spanish silver in a bustling Iberian port the next. Their most profound gift, however, was not a material good. They took the complex writing systems of the era and streamlined them into something revolutionary, an alphabet of just 22 characters. This was not a tool reserved for priests and kings. It was a system simple enough for merchants to keep records, a breakthrough that would eventually form the foundation of Greek, Latin, and our own scripts. This is the portrait of a pragmatic, innovative, and astonishingly successful people. Their ambitions stretched beyond trade routes. Where they saw opportunity, they planted colonies, independent city-states that stretched from Cyprus to Sicily and Sardinia to the coast of North Africa. The greatest of these was Carthage, founded according to legend by a queen named Dido. Carthage would grow to become a superpower in its own right, a gleaming metropolis that rivaled Rome. So we are left with a jarring contradiction. How does a society renowned for its sophistication, its commercial genius, and its world-changing intellectual gifts become synonymous in the historical record with the most primal and horrifying of rituals? The bridge between these two images is built not by Phoenician hands, but by the words of their greatest enemies. The brilliance of the Phoenicians cast a long and threatening shadow over their rivals. For the Greeks and later the Romans, these master merchants were not just competitors. They were a confounding puzzle, a people whose power seemed to flow from dark and unknowable sources. It is from their pens that the most vivid and horrifying accusations of child sacrifice emerge, painting a picture so specific it has haunted the Western imagination for 2 millennia. The Greek historian Cleitarchus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, described a gruesome statue in Carthage. He wrote of a bronze figure of the god Cronus, who the Phoenicians knew as Baal Hammon, with its hands outstretched and sloping downward. A child was placed upon these arms, and then, according to the account, it would roll off into a pit of fire below. The scene was said to be accompanied by the relentless beating of drums and the shriek of flutes, a cacophony deliberately meant to drown out the cries of the victims. Later writers like Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch would echo and elaborate on this ritual, which they called the Molk or Melech. Plutarch, in his work on superstition, writes of Carthaginian parents who, in times of great crisis like war or plague, would publicly offer up their own children, doing so with stone-faced composure, while the mothers stood by without a tear or a groan. These are not vague rumors, they are detailed, sensory narratives. You can almost hear the drums, see the glow of the fire, feel the chilling disconnect of the parents' reported stoicism. But here we must pause and apply the most crucial lens of historical investigation, the source. Who is telling this story, and why? Every single one of these writers was a citizen of a state that viewed Carthage as an existential enemy. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage were a fight to the death, a century-long struggle that culminated in Carthage being utterly erased from the map, its fields sown with salt. For Roman historians, portraying the Carthaginians as not just political foes but as moral monsters served a powerful purpose. It justified their annihilation. It framed Rome not as a brutal imperial power, but as a civilizing force eradicating a barbaric practice. So we are left with a fundamental question. Are these accounts a form of ancient journalism, a reliable report of a real ritual, or are they the ultimate propaganda, a weaponized narrative designed to dehumanize an enemy? The literary evidence is compelling in its consistency, but it is also deeply, irrevocably tainted by the bias of its authors. To find an answer, we must turn from what was written about the Carthaginians to what they left behind in the earth. The accusations did not only come from foreign enemies across the sea. A far more intimate condemnation echoes from within the Phoenicians' own cultural and linguistic family, found in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. Here, the practice is not described with the detached horror of a Greek historian, but with the fiery outrage of a prophet. Multiple books, including Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 2 Kings, thunder against the act of passing children through the fire to a god called Melech. The prophet Jeremiah, standing in the valley just outside Jerusalem, delivers a scathing indictment. He says the people have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, something, he declares, I did not command, nor did it come into my mind. The location is specific, a place called the Tophet in the valley of Hinnom. The act is clear, the burning of children, and the divine rejection is absolute. This is not enemy propaganda, it is a theological verdict from a shared Semitic tradition. But what exactly is being described? Scholars grapple with this text on several levels. First, is this a report of actual Phoenician or Canaanite rituals that neighboring Israelites witnessed and adopted in times of apostasy? The Phoenicians and the Israelites were neighbors, their languages were closely related, and their religious practices sometimes overlapped. The biblical condemnation could be pointing a finger at a real, observed ritual of their kin. Second, and more complex, is the possibility this was a metaphor. In the prophetic tradition, idolatry is often described as spiritual adultery, a betrayal of a covenant. Could passing children through the fire be a powerful metaphorical image for the ultimate betrayal, sacrificing the future of the nation, its children, to false gods? The language is so visceral it feels literal, but prophetic rhetoric is also deeply symbolic. Third, and most challenging, is the suggestion that this was not something the Israelites saw others do, but something they themselves actually practiced during periods of religious syncretism. The texts repeatedly condemn Israelites for doing this abomination, suggesting it wasn't just a foreign horror story, but a domestic temptation. This adds a profound layer to the historical accusation. It moves the charge from the realm of political slander to the realm of sacred condemnation. It suggests that within the very cultural world of the ancient Levant, this practice, whether real or perceived, was seen as the ultimate line that should not be crossed, the darkest form of idolatry. So we have two powerful streams of evidence converging, the literary accusations from enemies and the theological condemnations from kin. Both point toward a ritual of fire and children. But words on scrolls and tablets, even ancient ones, are not proof. They are claims. To find evidence you can hold in your hand, we must leave the world of texts and descend into the silent, dusty precincts of the Tophet itself. The words of enemies and prophets finally met their match in the dry earth of North Africa. In the 1920s, French archaeologists began excavating a sandy field just outside the ancient city walls of Carthage, in what is now Tunisia. What they uncovered would ignite a century-long debate. They found a sacred precinct, a walled enclosure that the ancient sources had named the Tophet. And it was not empty. The ground was dense with thousands of small, upright stone markers like a silent miniature forest. Carved with simple symbols and sometimes brief inscriptions, these stelae were clearly votive offerings, markers of a promise made to the gods. But it was what lay buried beneath them that sent a chill through the academic world, for under nearly every stone marker was a small clay urn, and inside each urn the excavators found the charred bones of a very young animal, or, in a staggering number of cases, the cremated remains of a human infant. Here was physical, tangible evidence that seemed to align perfectly with the ancient horror stories. A sacred space dedicated to Baal Hammon and his consort Tanit, filled with the burned remains of children, each burial marked with a stone acknowledging a vow. The initial interpretation was devastatingly straightforward. The archaeologists believed they had found the killing fields, the very site where the bronze statue of Cronus described by Cleitarchus once stood. Each small urn represented a life given, a sacrifice performed to fulfill a parental pledge to the gods. The discovery sent shockwaves far beyond academic circles. It appeared to be a grim and undeniable validation, proving that the Phoenicians of Carthage had indeed practiced ritual child sacrifice on an industrial scale. The legend was no longer just a story told by their enemies. It was now a story written in bone and ash buried in the ground. For decades, this interpretation stood as the dominant, haunting truth. But as with all great historical mysteries, the first answer is rarely the final one. A closer look at the bones themselves would soon introduce a troubling question, a whisper of doubt rising from the urns. What if these children had died from something far more ordinary and far more tragic than a blade or a fire? The urns held a silent, heartbreaking census. When archaeologists carefully sifted through the contents, they found the cremated remains of the very young. These were not the bones of adults or even older children. They were the tiny, fragile skeletal fragments of fetuses, newborns, and infants up to about 2 years old. Mixed in among them, in a significant number of urns, were the charred bones of young animals, primarily lambs and kids. This was the shocking physical evidence, the potential smoking gun. Each small urn seemed to tell the same grim story. A child or an animal had been burned, its remains collected and respectfully interred beneath a carved stone marker, a stele. And these stelae were not blank. Many bore a chillingly standard inscription, a formula dedicating the offering to the gods Baal Hammon and Tanit. It read simply, "To the Lady Tanit face of Baal and to the Lord Baal Hammon that which was vowed." Here was the apparent link between the literary accusations and the archaeological record. A sacred precinct, the Tophet, filled with the burned bones of babies, each burial marked with a vow to the very gods the ancient writers accused of demanding such a price. The interpretation felt inevitable. This was not a cemetery in the ordinary sense. The sheer volume of urns, tens of thousands over centuries, the specific age range of the children, and the consistent devotional language all pointed to one conclusion for those early excavators. They believed they were looking at the physical proof of ritual sacrifice, a systematic practice where parents, perhaps during a crisis or to fulfill a solemn oath, offered the life of their child in exchange for divine favor. The stones were the receipts and the urns were the terrible delivery. For a long time, this was the accepted, if horrifying, truth. But truth in archaeology is rarely so settled. A new generation of scholars would begin to look at these same urns, these same tiny bones, and ask a profoundly different question. What if we have misunderstood the tragedy we uncovered? The Tophet was not a hidden chamber or a secret altar. It was a sprawling, open-air sanctuary, a field of devotion set apart from the bustling city of Carthage and its regular cemeteries. Walking into this space in its heyday, you would have entered a sacred precinct dedicated entirely to the gods Baal Hammon and Tanit. It was not a place for the dead in general, but a specific, solemn ground for these particular offerings. The air would have smelled of incense and perhaps the lingering scent of fire. Your eyes would be drawn not to grand statues, but to a forest of small, upright stone markers, each one standing like a silent sentinel over a buried urn. This was a landscape of vows made and fulfilled, a physical archive of promises to the divine. The stones themselves, called stelae, are the key to understanding the intent behind this place. They are carved with a consistent, powerful iconography. The most common symbol is the sign of the goddess Tanit, a stylized figure with a triangular body, a horizontal bar for arms raised as if in blessing or reception, and a circle for a head. It is an abstract, almost modern-looking emblem that appears everywhere. Alongside it, you often find the disc and crescent, a symbol associated with Baal Hammon, representing the sun and moon, a marker of celestial power. But some stones go further. A handful bear carved scenes that scholars have pored over for decades. One might show a figure, perhaps a priest, holding a small, swaddled bundle. Another might depict an altar. Yet another shows a priest standing before a symbol of Tanit with what appears to be a small child in his arms. These are not explicit images of violence, but they are deeply suggestive ritual tableaus. When you combine this consistent visual language with the physical layout, the argument becomes compelling. This was a specialized, consecrated space maintained for over 600 years. The sheer number of stelae, running into the many thousands, points to a widespread, institutionalized custom, not a rare, desperate act. The icons of the gods receiving the offering are everywhere. The scenes, however ambiguous, hint at a ceremony, and beneath every stone, the physical evidence of a cremated child or lamb. The architecture and artifacts build a circumstantial case that is difficult to dismiss. They paint a picture of a society that engaged in a profound and somber ritual, one that connected the fate of their youngest to the favor of their gods, generation after generation. But a strong case is not an irrefutable one, and from within this very evidence, a powerful counter-argument began to grow. For decades, the story seemed clear and horrifyingly complete. Scholars wove the threads of enemy accusation, biblical condemnation, and archaeological discovery into a single, grim tapestry. This became the standard interpretation, the accepted history taught in textbooks. It proposed a specific and devastating ritual born from absolute devotion or absolute desperation. According to this narrative, a Carthaginian couple, perhaps facing a city-wide plague, a looming invasion, or a personal catastrophe, would make a vow. They would promise to the gods Baal Hammon and Tanit the most precious thing they could offer, their firstborn son. This was not a casual promise. It was a sacred contract, a grisly pact for survival or success. When the time came to fulfill it, a solemn ceremony would unfold. The family, alongside priests, would process to the sacred precinct of the Tophet. There, according to descriptions pieced from Greek texts and the archaeological setting, stood a bronze statue of the god. Its arms were outstretched and sloped downward, heated perhaps by fires from below. The child would be placed upon these arms. Then, with the rhythmic pounding of drums and the shrill cry of flutes meant to mask all other sound, the infant would roll from the statue's grasp, falling into a ritual fire pit below. The act was not one of anger, but of obligation, a transaction with the divine where life was the ultimate currency. After the flames subsided, the priests would carefully collect the charred bones and ashes. These remains would be placed with reverence into a small clay urn. The urn was then buried in the sacred ground, and above it, the family would erect a stone marker, a stele. On this stone, they would carve the symbols of Tanit and Baal Hammon, and often that brief, chilling inscription, a record of the vow now fulfilled. This narrative provided a powerful, if terrible, logic to everything found at the site. It explained why the urns held only the very young. It explained the thousands of nearly identical markers, a testament to a widespread, institutionalized practice. It explained the animal bones as possible substitutes, a lesser offering if a child was not available. For much of the 20th century, this was the settled truth. Carthage, for all its sophistication, harbored this dark, secret heart. The legend was not a lie, it was a confirmed historical horror. But a story that fits the evidence too neatly can sometimes blind us to other possibilities. And soon, a handful of scholars began to ask whether we had been telling ourselves the most dramatic story rather than the most true one. But a theory built on such terrible foundations invites its own scrutiny. In the late 20th century, a quiet revolution began in the study of Carthage, led by scholars like Sergio Ribiccini and Paolo Zella. They looked at the same silent field of urns and saw not a confirmation of ancient horror, but a potential misinterpretation of ancient grief. Their argument started with a simple, sobering fact of life in the ancient world. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Without modern medicine, childbirth was perilous, and diseases that are minor today could be fatal for a newborn. It was tragically common for families to lose a child, so Ribiccini and Zella asked a profound question. What if the Tophet was not a place of killing, but a sacred resting place for babies who had already died? In this view, the precinct was a special cemetery, a consecrated ground where parents could bury their infants with unique honors, offering them directly to the protection of the gods Tanit and Baal Hammon in the afterlife. The animal bones found in many urns took on a new meaning. Rather than being substitutes for a living child in a sacrifice, perhaps they were symbolic companions, a lamb or kid offered alongside the deceased infant as a gift to the gods, a practice seen in other ancient cultures. The vows mentioned on the stelae, then, were not promises to give a life, but prayers made in desperation for a child's survival, or thanks given after a peaceful passing. This interpretation reframed everything. The drums and flutes described by Greek writers might have been part of a funeral rite, not a mask for screams. The Stoic parents described by Plutarch might simply have been displaying the dignified grief expected in their culture. The cracks in the consensus were not small. They challenged the very premise that had seemed so obvious for generations. If this was true, then the entire narrative of Phoenician child sacrifice was a catastrophic error, a confusion of ancient burial customs with ancient atrocity. But to prove it, they needed more than a compelling alternative. They needed to look closer, much closer, at the silent witnesses themselves, the tiny bones in the urns. The bones themselves began to whisper a different story under the microscope. When bioarchaeologists like Jeffrey Schwartz meticulously studied the charred fragments from the Carthage Tophet, they were not looking for proof of a blade or a violent death which cremation would have erased. Instead, they searched for a demographic pattern, a statistical fingerprint that could reveal the truth. What they found was quietly devastating, and it pointed away from the altar and toward the cradle. The vast majority of these tiny remains were from infants who died at a very specific, vulnerable stage in the perinatal period. This term covers the fragile window from late gestation through the first month of life, a time of immense risk in the ancient world. The age distribution showed a clear, heartbreaking peak right at birth and immediately after. This is precisely the pattern you would expect from natural causes, from complications during delivery, from congenital conditions, or from infections that a newborn's immune system could not fight. If these children were victims of a selective sacrifice, you would expect a different profile, perhaps a focus on older infants or a more random spread of ages. But the bones told a story of biological tragedy, not ritual selection. Then came the sheer, staggering scale of the numbers, which presented a logistical and demographic puzzle that seemed almost impossible to solve. At Carthage alone, over centuries of use, archaeologists estimate there are the remains of over 20,000 infants in the Tophet. To put that into perspective, think of a city like ancient Carthage at its height, with a population scholars estimate at perhaps 200,000 people. For the Tophet to contain only sacrificial victims, the city would have had to sustain an unimaginable rate of ritual killing. The mathematics simply do not add up. The birth rate necessary to provide that many children for sacrifice, on top of the children needed to maintain the population itself, would have been demographically catastrophic. It would have meant a society actively and systematically working to erase its own future, generation after generation, which is a practical absurdity. The numbers pointed to a much more plausible, if still profoundly sad, explanation. The Tophet likely contains the remains of a significant portion, perhaps even the majority, of all infants who died in Carthage over hundreds of years. They were not a special class of ritually murdered children. They were simply all the babies the city lost given a distinctive and sacred burial. This statistical evidence forced a monumental shift in thinking. It suggested the ancient writers, both the enemies and the prophets, may have witnessed these very public, emotionally charged funeral rites for countless dead babies and tragically misinterpreted what they were seeing. They saw the fire, the urns, the stoic parents, and the dedications to stern gods, and they assembled a narrative of horror. But the bones, in their silent multitude, argue that the real horror was the everyday, unavoidable reality of infant mortality in the ancient world. But the bones in the urns tell another story, one that is not exclusively human. Scattered among the remains of infants, archaeologists found something that complicates the picture further. The charred bones of very young animals, lambs and kids just weeks or months old. These were not accidental inclusions or later intrusions. They were deliberately placed, often mixed right in with the tiny human bones in the same sacred urn. This single fact, the presence of the animal remains, has become a pivotal battleground in the debate, because how you interpret these lambs determines whether you see a cemetery or a killing field. The traditional, sacrificial interpretation gives these animals a specific and heartbreaking role. They are seen as substitutes. In this view, the ritual demanded a life, but perhaps not always a human one. If a family was wealthy enough, or if they had special status, or if they appealed to the priests with sufficient offerings, they might be permitted to redeem their vowed child. They could purchase a young lamb or goat, and this animal would be sacrificed in the child's place. The animal would die so the child could live. The mixed ashes in the urn then represent a transaction completed, a life for a life, with the animal standing in as the symbolic payment. This idea draws support from a few ancient sources, like the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, where a ram is provided as a substitute sacrifice at the last moment. It suggests a ritual with a built-in loophole, a grim economy where the very wealthy might spare their children while the poor could not. The revisionist view, however, paints an entirely different picture. Here, the lambs and kids are not substitutes for a living child, but companions for a deceased one. In this interpretation, the infant died of natural causes. The grieving parents bringing their child to the special sanctuary of the Tophet for burial would include a young animal as a gift. This was not a life taken, but a valuable possession offered. The lamb was a tender, pure offering to the gods Tanit and Baal Hammon, perhaps to ensure their favor and protection for the infant's journey into the afterlife. Think of it as placing a favorite toy or a precious belonging in a child's casket, a universal human impulse to send the departed with something of value. The mixing of the ashes signifies unity, the animal accompanying and serving the child in death. This practice has parallels in other ancient cultures, where animals were buried with people not as sacrifices, but as provisions or symbolic protectors. The implications of these two interpretations could not be more different. If the animals are substitutes, then the Tophet is indeed a place of ritual killing. a site where the fundamental transaction was the taking of life, whether animal or human. The presence of some animal bones merely softens the horror, suggesting a tiered system, but it still confirms the core sacrificial nature of the site. If, however, the animals are companions, the entire character of the Tophet changes. It becomes a sacred neonatal cemetery, a place of profound grief and religious consolation, where the primary ritual was one of burial and dedication, not execution. The fire was for cremation, a respectful means of preparing the body, not a tool of murder. The choice between these two visions hinges on a simple, haunting question. Were the lambs and kids brought to the Tophet to die instead of the children, or to die alongside them? This silent forest of stone markers holds its own testimony, carved directly by Carthaginian hands. To break the stalemate between modern theories, we must listen to the words the Phoenicians left for us. Thousands of these stelae bear a short, standard inscription. For over a century, it has been translated in a way that seems to seal the case. It reads, "To the Lady Tanit face of Baal, and to the Lord Baal Hammon, that which was vowed." The phrase "that which was vowed," in Latin res devota, feels chillingly vague. It is easy to hear in that vagueness the unspoken horror, the promised child. This translation became the cornerstone of the sacrificial interpretation, the direct epigraphic link between the site and a vow that required a life. But language is a living, shifting thing, and the field of Punic epigraphy is notoriously difficult. The Phoenician language has no living descendants, and our understanding is pieced together from a limited corpus. Newer, more nuanced readings of these same words are now challenging that century-old assumption. The key contention lies in that pivotal phrase. Some linguists argue it does not inherently mean a sacrificial offering at all. They suggest it could be interpreted more broadly as a thing dedicated or a gift presented. This might seem like a minor semantic quibble, but it opens a door to a completely different understanding of the ritual. Perhaps the thing dedicated was not the child's life, but the stone marker itself, or the accompanying animal, or even a monetary offering given to the temple. Even more transformative is a re-examination of the inscription's grammatical structure. Could the dedication be made on behalf of a child rather than consisting of a child? This subtle shift turns a record of death into a record of devotion. Imagine a parent carving, "To Tanit and Baal Hammon for my son, that which was vowed." The meaning flips entirely. The child is the beneficiary of the prayer and the dedication, not the object being given. The stone becomes a plea for protection in the afterlife, or a thank you for a brief life, not a receipt for a life taken. The challenge is that we lack a definitive Phoenician handbook of ritual terms. We are trying to reconstruct the emotional and theological weight of phrases from a dead culture using fragmentary evidence. The same word might have carried connotations we can no longer hear. This linguistic uncertainty means the primary written evidence from the Carthaginians themselves, the very words they chose to memorialize these events, is now fiercely contested ground. It no longer provides a clear answer, but instead reflects the modern debate back at us. Depending on how you tilt the prism of translation, the stones can either whisper of a terrible vow fulfilled or murmur a parent's enduring grief. Carthage was not an isolated case. The same silent fields of stone markers and burial urns have been found scattered across the western Mediterranean, wherever Phoenician colonists planted their flags. On the island of Motia, off the coast of Sicily, archaeologists uncovered a Tophet sanctuary strikingly similar to the one in Carthage, with stelae dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon covering the cremated remains of infants and lambs. Further north, on Sardinia, the colonies of Solsis and Tharos held their own sacred precincts, echoing the same sobering pattern. This geographic spread is crucial. It tells us that whatever was happening in these walled enclosures was not a strange local cult unique to Carthage, but a widespread, fundamental practice across the Punic world. It was a shared tradition, a piece of cultural and religious identity that these far-flung communities carried with them from their Levantine homeland and maintained for centuries. The uniformity is arresting. From North Africa to the islands of the central Mediterranean, the physical blueprint is repeated, a sacred space set apart, filled with urns and marked with stones bearing the same divine symbols. This consistency seems, at first glance, to be the final nail in the coffin for the revisionist argument. How could so many independent colonies over such a vast area all coincidentally develop the same bizarre and macabre cemetery exclusively for babies? Wouldn't a shared ritual of sacrifice better explain such rigid uniformity? The answer, however, is not so simple. Think of it this way: all Christian churches have baptismal fonts, and all Muslim mosques have areas for ritual washing. These uniform features don't prove a specific violent act, they point to a shared belief system and its associated rites. The widespread Tophets could just as easily indicate a shared and special funerary practice for children who died before they could be integrated into the full community. Many cultures throughout history have had separate burial grounds for infants, reflecting a distinct spiritual status. The babies in these colonies may have been seen as belonging directly to the gods, requiring a dedicated form of burial to ensure their peaceful passage. So the comparative evidence presents us with a paradox. On one hand, the sheer geographic scale makes the idea of a universal, gruesome secret seem more plausible, a dark thread woven into the fabric of Punic identity. On the other, that same scale could simply reflect a universal, deeply felt cultural response to a universal tragedy, the loss of a child. The stones from Motia and the urns from Tharos do not speak any clearer than those from Carthage. They only whisper the same ambiguous story in more places. This widespread phenomenon adds immense weight to the mystery, but it does not, in itself, tip the scales. It shows us a civilization grappling with life, death, and the divine in a concerted way, but leaves us still standing at the edge of the sacred precinct, wondering what exactly we are looking at. The carved scenes on the stelae demand a second look, one unclouded by expectation. For generations, a figure holding a swaddled bundle was seen as a priest presenting a sacrificial victim. But is that the only story these stone pictures can tell? In a culture with such high infant mortality, a priest holding a child could just as easily represent a blessing ceremony, a ritual of naming or protection performed shortly after birth, or even a somber funerary rite where the infant is entrusted to the gods. The image is ambiguous, its meaning locked in a moment we can no longer fully decode. To unlock it, we must widen our gaze to the other symbols that fill these stones, symbols that whisper of care, not cruelty. Alongside the stark figure, you often find the caduceus, a staff entwined with serpents. To the Greeks and Romans, this was the symbol of Hermes, a messenger god. But its origins are older, and in the Near East, such a staff was deeply associated with healing deities and the renewal of life. Its presence on a child's memorial stone could be a plea for healing in the afterlife, or a marker of a death by illness. Then there is the open hand, a powerful and recurring motif. Across countless ancient cultures, the open hand is a nearly universal symbol of protection, blessing, and divine power, used to ward off evil. Carved above a burial urn, it reads less like a weapon and more like a shield, a guardian sign placed over the remains of the vulnerable. Perhaps most poignant is the simple bottle that appears on some markers. Scholars debate its contents. Was it perfume for anointing, oil for a lamp to light the darkness, or milk, the sustenance of life? In a funerary context, each possibility points toward tenderness. Perfume honors the body, oil provides light for the journey, and milk symbolizes nourishment the child was denied in life, offered now in death. When you assemble this iconography, a different portrait emerges from the stone. We see not a tableau of violence, but a lexicon of loss and hope, a healing staff, a protective hand, a vessel of sustenance, and a figure gently cradling an infant. This collection of symbols aligns far more naturally with the world of mourning, with rituals designed to safeguard a soul and comfort the living. It suggests the Tophet was a place where parents confronted the cruel fragility of new life, arming their lost children with every symbolic protection they could imagine for the journey ahead. If this reading is correct, then the great tragedy is doubled, for we have not only misunderstood their grief, we have weaponized it against their memory. The numbers alone force us to reconsider everything. In the ancient world, the simple act of being born was a perilous journey. Historians and demographers estimate that in pre-modern societies without modern medicine or sanitation, as many as 30 to 50% of all children died before reaching their 5th birthday. A huge portion of these losses happened in the first days, weeks, or months of life, a period of immense vulnerability. This was not a rare tragedy, it was a constant, heartbreaking background hum to family life. In the face of such staggering loss, cultures worldwide developed distinct ways to handle these tiny deaths. A child who died before being named, before taking solid food, before being formally integrated into the community, often occupied a unique spiritual category. They were liminal beings, not yet fully of this world, and therefore their passage into the next required special rites. They were frequently buried separately from adults, sometimes within the home, sometimes in dedicated plots, their graves marked with simple tokens or none at all. This is the sobering, human context that revisionist scholars ask us to place the Tophet within. They propose that we are not looking at a site of sacrifice, but at a massive, communal, sacred cemetery. In this view, the precinct was the Punic world's answer to a universal sorrow. When a Carthaginian family lost an infant, they did not inter the child in the regular city cemeteries. Instead, they brought the tiny body to the consecrated ground of Tanit and Baal Hammon. There, the child would be cremated, a purifying fire that prepared the remains. The ashes were collected in an urn, and a stone was erected above it, not as a receipt for a life taken, but as a permanent memorial, a marker of a brief existence that mattered. The dedication to the gods changes meaning entirely under this light. It was not a payment for future favor, but a plea for protection in the hereafter. By offering the child directly to the deities, the parents were entrusting their lost son or daughter to divine guardianship, ensuring a safe journey to an afterlife they feared the uninitiated infant could not navigate alone. The animal bones found alongside them, the lambs and kids, become parting gifts, valuable companions for that journey. Think of it not as a sacrifice, but as the most profound act of care a grieving parent could perform. They were wrapping their child in ritual, arming them with symbols and offerings, and placing them under the direct patronage of the gods. The vow mentioned on the stelae could then be a prayer uttered in desperation during a difficult birth, a promise of a memorial stone if the gods would spare the child, or simply the fulfillment of a cultural obligation to consecrate any infant who died. This theory reframes the Carthaginians not as monsters, but as a people intimately acquainted with grief, who built a complex, beautiful, and consistent system to cope with a relentless natural reality. It turns the Tophet from a monument of horror into a monument of love and loss, a field of tiny stones where an entire civilization whispered its sorrows to the heavens. Yet if this is true, it creates a new and equally difficult mystery. Why would their enemies so completely and vividly misunderstand such an act of devotion? Just when the revisionist theory seemed to offer a gentler answer, science delivered a stunning blow. In the early 2010s, a team of researchers led by physical anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz did something no one had done with such precision before. They took the charred bones from the Carthage Tophet and subjected them to a rigorous statistical comparison. They didn't just look at the bones in isolation, they compared them to a known baseline, the skeletal remains of infants from other ancient sites who had unquestionably died from natural causes. These were the babies from regular cemeteries, where the heartbreaking signature of ancient infant mortality was clearly written in the bones. In those natural mortality samples, the pattern is brutally predictable. There is a massive, overwhelming peak of death in the perinatal period, that fragile window from late pregnancy through the first month of life. This is the demographic fingerprint of natural tragedy. When Schwartz's team charted the ages of the Tophet infants, they found something startlingly different. The pattern did not match. The expected, crushing peak of perinatal deaths was not there. Instead, the age distribution was more spread out, with a significant number of infants who were 1 to 2 months old, and even some up to 2 years. This was not the profile of a population succumbing to the natural hazards of ancient childbirth and disease. It looked statistically like a selection. The bones seemed to be telling a new story, one that pointed back toward the old, terrible idea. If these children were all dying naturally, why did their age profile not look like every other ancient infant cemetery? The implication was chilling. It suggested the infants in the Tophet were not a random cross-section of all babies who died, but a specific group. They were being chosen, or their deaths were being recorded, based on something other than simple biological fate. This osteological analysis, published in a major scientific journal, hit the academic world like a thunderclap. It provided the first hard, quantitative data that seemed to undermine the revisionist cemetery theory. The debate, which had been leaning toward a consensus of misunderstanding, was now violently reignited. The old ghosts of sacrifice had been summoned back to the table, not by poets or enemies, but by numbers and bone measurements. The field was plunged back into uncertainty, forced to reconcile this new scientific evidence with the powerful arguments about demography and grief. It was no longer a battle of texts versus artifacts, but of science versus science, of one interpretation of bones against another. The bones hold one final secret in their very structure, a clue locked in the way they burned. Forensic archaeologists face a daunting task, peering back through the ashes of millennia to answer a seemingly simple question. Was this child alive or already dead when the fire touched them? The heat of a cremation pyre is a brutal eraser. It consumes flesh, organs, and all the delicate forensic markers a modern pathologist would rely on to determine a cause of death. A knife wound, signs of suffocation, evidence of disease, all of it can be obliterated by the flames. So scientists must look for subtler signs, reading the story of the fire itself as it interacted with the body. The key lies in the state of the corpse when it was burned. Think of a log in a fireplace. A fresh, green log full of moisture will burn slowly, crackling and smoking. A dry, seasoned log, already stripped of its sap, will burn quickly and evenly. A human body behaves in a similar way. If a body is burned shortly after death, when it is still fleshed, the bones are protected by a layer of soft tissue. The fire must work its way through muscle and skin to reach the skeleton. This process leaves a distinct signature on the bones themselves. They tend to show more warping, more cracking, and a greater variation in color, from black charring to white calcination, as the heat penetrates unevenly. The bones may also be more fragmented from the stresses of shrinking, burning flesh around them. Now consider the alternative. If a body was buried or stored for some time before being exhumed and cremated, the soft tissues would have largely decomposed. The bones would be dry and clean, or perhaps held together by ligaments. A skeletonized body burns very differently. The bones, exposed directly to the flame, tend to show more uniform coloration, less warping, and fewer fractures. They are, in essence, that dry log, burning more cleanly. This distinction is the forensic grail for Tophet researchers. If the bones show patterns consistent with fleshed cremation, it suggests the infant was burned soon after death, which could align with a sacrificial ritual. If the patterns point to burned dry bones, it suggests a secondary burial where the remains were retrieved from a primary grave and later cremated, which fits a funerary reinterpretation. So what have the studies found? The results are a masterclass in ambiguity. Some analyses of the Carthaginian remains point toward fleshed cremation. They note the extreme fragmentation of the bones and specific color patterns that hint the bodies were not completely skeletonized. Other researchers, looking at samples from different urns or using different analytical methods, argue the evidence is inconclusive or could even support the burning of dry bones. The limitations are profound. The intensity and duration of the ancient pyre are unknown variables that can completely change the bone's appearance. The position of the body in the fire, whether it was turned or left alone, affects the burn patterns. Even the age of the infant matters, as the bones of a newborn are mostly cartilage and burn differently than those of a 2-year-old. After all this meticulous science, we are left not with a verdict but with a reflection of our own debate. The forensic clues whisper in both directions, proving only one thing for certain, that the fire was real and that it touched these children long ago. The question of what brought them to that fire, however, remains stubbornly in the smoke. The smoke from the forensic pyres leads us to a darker, more human fire, the fire of hatred. To understand why this accusation has burned for 2,000 years, we must step back and examine not the Phoenicians but their accusers. Why were the Greeks, the Romans, and the biblical prophets so utterly captivated by this specific horror? The answer lies not in archaeology but in the brutal politics of identity and war. When a society faces a rival it fears or cannot understand, it often paints that rival as a monster. This process, called othering, is ancient and devastatingly effective. The brilliant, wealthy, and mysterious Phoenicians, and especially their powerful colony Carthage, were the ultimate others to the emerging civilizations of Greece and Rome. They were not just competitors for trade routes or territory, they were a cultural puzzle. Their success seemed unearned by traditional virtues like military conquest on land. To the Greek mind, fixated on philosophy and civic virtue, and later to the Roman ideal of disciplined order, the Phoenician power, built on commerce and naval skill, felt alien and suspicious. How do you justify destroying such a people? You tell a story that makes their annihilation not just strategic but moral. You claim they practice something so abhorrent, so against the natural order, that wiping them from the earth becomes a sacred duty. The narrative of child sacrifice is the ultimate propaganda weapon. It dehumanizes the enemy completely. A people who would kill their own young are not just adversaries, they are a cancer on humanity itself. This was not casual slander, it was a calculated narrative for wartime consumption. The Romans did not just defeat Carthage in the Punic Wars, they erased it, literally sowing the fields with salt so nothing would grow. To make such total destruction palatable to their own citizens and to history, they needed a reason that transcended politics. What better reason than the rescue of civilization from baby killers? This trope is not confined to antiquity. Across history, in conflicts great and small, the most potent way to rally hatred is to accuse the enemy of atrocities against the innocent, especially children. It is a story that bypasses logic and strikes directly at our deepest instincts to protect. So the persistent tales from Roman historians must be read with this chilling context. They are less likely to be dispassionate reportage and more likely to be the victor's justification, a necessary myth to cleanse the conscience of an empire that committed what we would now call genocide. The biblical prophets, while coming from a different place of theological conflict, used a similar rhetorical tool. By condemning their Canaanite neighbors and even their own backsliding people for this practice, they were drawing the brightest possible line between righteous worship and idolatrous barbarism. In all these cases, the story of child sacrifice served a powerful purpose, defining us versus them in the starkest, most emotionally charged terms possible. This realization forces a difficult question. If the accusation was so useful, so politically potent, does that automatically make it false, or could a kernel of real ritual have been exaggerated into a monstrous legend? We are left navigating between two terrible possibilities, one of a civilization that committed this act, and another of a civilization that was systematically slandered for it. The truth may be the most uncomfortable place of all, caught somewhere in the middle. So the debate is not merely about ancient bones, it is a mirror held up to our own time. Why does a 2,000-year-old accusation still ignite such fierce argument among scholars today? Because at its heart, this is not a question about what the Phoenicians did, but about how we choose to see them. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable lens of cultural relativism. Can we judge a people from the distant past by the moral standards of our present? If they did practice ritual child sacrifice, was it to them an act of profound piety, a necessary transaction with divine powers they believed controlled famine, war, and survival? Our immediate revulsion may blind us to the possibility that within their worldview, this was not an act of cruelty but of ultimate commitment. The danger, however, swings both ways. In our modern desire to avoid casting historical judgment, to be respectful of other cultures, do we risk explaining away something that was, even by the standards of their own contemporaries, considered extreme? Their enemies condemned it, and their cultural cousins in the Hebrew scriptures framed it as the worst form of apostasy. This suggests that within the ancient Mediterranean world, this practice, if it existed, was already on the far edge of acceptable behavior. Wrestling with this tension is the historian's essential responsibility. It is the balance between understanding a culture on its own terms and acknowledging that some human acts might transcend cultural context. This leads directly to the problem of sources. The Carthaginian case is a masterclass in the perils of historical evidence. We have the vivid, hate-filled accounts of their destroyers, and we have the silent, ambiguous archaeology they left behind. The written word is powerful and persuasive, but it comes dripping with bias. The material evidence is tangible, but its language is cryptic. Do we trust the storytellers who had every reason to lie, or the objects that cannot speak for themselves? Our interpretation says as much about us as it does about them. Are we, like the Romans, still subconsciously looking for reasons to justify viewing a brilliant rival as barbaric? Does the sensational story of blood on the altar simply make for a more compelling, more memorable history than one of complex maritime traders? This taps into a profound ethical question about interpreting other cultures, past and present. When we lead with the most shocking story, we risk defining an entire civilization by its darkest potential ritual. For the Phoenicians, this is a catastrophic overshadowing. Their legacy is the very foundation of our global communication. They took the cumbersome writing systems of empires and distilled them into an accessible alphabet, a tool of commerce that became the engine of literature, law, and science. They were the first great network of the Mediterranean, weaving together continents through trade, spreading goods, ideas, and technology. To reduce them to a single, horrifying question is to erase their monumental role in building the world we know. It simplifies them into a moral fable, a cautionary tale of civilization's dark side, and in doing so, it steals their true complexity. The debate matters because it is a fight for their memory. It is a reminder that history is not a fixed set of facts, but an ongoing conversation between the past and the present. We must be wary of the single story, whether it comes from a Roman victor or a modern textbook. The Phoenicians deserve more than to be remembered as either monsters or martyrs. They deserve to be seen in full, in all their ingenious, ambitious, and yes, potentially conflicted humanity. The quiet field of Urns in Carthage asks us one final, enduring question. Can we hold two truths in our minds at once? The truth of their unparalleled achievements and the haunting, unresolved mystery of what those parents, standing before the symbols of Tanit and Baal Hammon, truly believed they were doing. The island of Sardinia holds a piece of this puzzle that refuses to fit neatly into either narrative. At a windswept hilltop settlement called Monte Surai, archaeologists uncovered a Tophet, a sacred precinct with the familiar stone markers dedicated to Tanit and Baal Hammon. But when they carefully opened the burial urns, they found a startling deviation from the pattern at Carthage. Here, the vast majority of the urns contained only the charred bones of young animals, lambs and kids. The remains of human infants were present, but they were the rare exception, not the overwhelming rule. This single site, a quiet outpost of the Punic world, throws a wrench into every sweeping theory. What are we to make of a Tophet that seems to have very few Tophets in the sense of child burials? Does Monte Sur-I represent a regional variation where the practice was different? Could it show a later evolution, a moment in time where animal offerings had fully replaced any earlier human ones? Or, most provocatively, does this site suggest that the core function of these precincts was always about animal sacrifice, and that the presence of infants elsewhere was a separate, though related, tradition? This is not a minor detail. It forces us to abandon the idea of a single, monolithic Phoenician practice enforced uniformly from a central authority. The Punic world was a network of independent city-states, each with its own local customs and interpretations of shared rituals. What was deemed necessary in the powerful metropolis of Carthage may have been adapted, softened, or transformed in a smaller colony like Monte Sur-I. Perhaps here, the substitution of an animal for a child was not a loophole, but the standard practice from the very beginning. The community may have viewed the offering of a valuable lamb as sufficient to fulfill any vow or funeral rite, reserving the inclusion of a human infant's ashes for only the most exceptional of circumstances. This case study shatters the illusion of a simple answer. It demonstrates that the Phoenician relationship with their gods and their rituals for the dead were as diverse and adaptable as their trade routes. We cannot point to Carthage and declare we understand the entire phenomenon, just as we cannot point to Monte Sur-I and claim it disproves everything. Instead, we are left with a mosaic of practices, a spectrum of behavior that ranged from precincts filled with infant remains to those filled almost entirely with animals. This complexity is the death of any blanket conclusion. It tells us that the real story is not one of a single dark secret, but of many communities grappling with faith, loss, and obligation in their own ways. The silence from Monte Sur-I is different, but it speaks just as loudly, reminding us that history is rarely a uniform shadow, but a patchwork of light and dark. This profound silence from the people themselves is the most haunting piece of the entire puzzle. We have the vivid accusations of their enemies, the solemn condemnations of their kin, and the ambiguous archaeology from their sacred grounds. But what did the Phoenicians say about it? The answer is a void, an echoing absence that forces us to confront the biggest hole in the evidence. The Phoenicians were not an illiterate people, far from it. They were the inventors of the alphabet, prodigious writers who kept records on papyrus scrolls and parchment. They wrote histories, laws, poetry, and detailed religious texts. And yet, almost none of it survives. The humid climate of their Levantine homeland and the passage of millennia have rotted their paper archives to dust. What remains are the things carved in stone, the inscriptions on those stelae in the Tophet, on temple walls and on tombs. These are terse, formal, and ritualistic by their very nature. They are not personal diaries or theological manuals explaining doctrine. They are brief public declarations, like reading only the engraved dedications on cemetery headstones and trying to reconstruct the complete funeral service from that one line. So we are left with a critical, unsettling question. If ritual child sacrifice was a central, sanctioned tenet of their state religion, practiced openly for centuries, wouldn't we expect to find at least one clear, first-hand reference to it in their own surviving words? Wouldn't there be a law regulating it, a priestly text prescribing the ritual formula, a fragment of a hymn that mentions the offering? Their own stone markers speak of vows and dedications, but never explicitly of taking a life. This silence is deafening, and it cuts both ways in the debate. On one hand, this absence could be damning. It could mean they knew the practice was so extreme, so potentially shocking even within their own cultural sphere, that they deliberately avoided writing about it openly. They hid it in euphemism, in the vague language of the vow, never committing the grim details to a permanent record that could fall into the wrong hands. Their silence in this view becomes a form of guilty secrecy. On the other hand, and perhaps more powerfully, this silence could be exculpatory. What if they didn't write about it explicitly because the thing their enemies described simply did not exist as an institutional practice? You do not write laws against a crime no one commits. You do not inscribe priestly instructions for a ritual you never perform. Their surviving records talk of trade, of treaties, of dedications to the gods for blessings received. The absence of any first-hand account of ritual killing could be the most significant piece of evidence we have, a silent testimony that the horror story was just that, a story told by others. Think of your own life. If someone accused you of a shocking, recurring act, the first place investigators would look for proof would be in your own journals, your own emails, your own words. If they found nothing but mundane records of your daily routine, that absence would speak volumes. We are in that same position with the Phoenicians, sifting through the fragments of their own voice, listening for a confession or an explanation, and hearing only the wind through the cedars and the lap of waves against their ships. This void forces us to rely on interpreters, on outsiders who may have witnessed something they profoundly misunderstood, or who may have needed a monster to justify a war. The Phoenicians' own story, in their own words, is the one chapter of this mystery that is forever lost, and in that loss, the legend finds both its greatest weakness and its most persistent shadow. The word sacrifice carries a heavy and specific meaning. It implies a conscious, deliberate act of giving up something of great value, often a life, to a higher power. But what if the value of the offering, in the eyes of the giver, was not what we assume? To unravel this, we must step back from the loaded term and examine the possible rituals with colder, more precise language. Even if we accept that some form of ritual killing occurred at Carthage, does it automatically qualify as a sacrifice in the classical sense? A traditional sacrifice is a transaction. You offer something precious like a prized bull or the first fruits of a harvest to a deity. In return, you seek something, favor in battle, a good harvest, the lifting of a plague. The offering is whole and healthy, its destruction a real loss that creates a debt the god is expected to repay. But consider a different scenario, one drawn from archaeological hints and comparative anthropology. What if the infant was not healthy? What if it was stillborn or born with a grave deformity or so sickly it was not expected to live? In many ancient cultures, such a child was seen as marked by the gods or as an ill omen for the family or the entire community. Its death was not a surprise but an expected tragedy. In this context, the ritual at the Tophet might not have been about taking a life, but about managing a death that was already inevitable. The act of cremation and dedication could have been a form of ritual purification, a way to safely return a troubled soul to the divine realm from which it came, thereby protecting the living from misfortune. This transforms the event from a sacrifice of a valued life into a sacred funeral for a life that could not be sustained. The offering is not the child's future, but its already fated body, given back to the gods with prayers for peace and protection. This distinction is not just semantic, it changes the entire moral framework. One is an active killing for gain, the other is a reactive rite of passage for a loss that nature had already decreed. Another theory points to moments of extreme existential crisis. Ancient sources sometimes mention child offerings during sieges, plagues, or natural disasters. In the white-hot panic of a city facing annihilation, could a community have performed a desperate, one-time ritual, offering what was most precious in a final plea for salvation? This would be a true sacrifice, but a rare and catastrophic exception, not a regular, institutional practice. Such an event, burned into cultural memory, could have been magnified by enemies into a defining characteristic. There is also the haunting concept of the foundation sacrifice. Across the ancient world, from Europe to Asia to the Americas, legends speak of burying a living person, often a child, in the foundations of a city wall, a bridge, or a temple. The belief was that the spirit of the victim would become a guardian, eternally protecting the structure. If something like this happened at the founding of Carthage or its major temples, it would have been a singular, monumental event, not a recurring custom. Yet that one story could have echoed down centuries, morphing into a tale of routine horror. The crucial point is this: our modern revulsion at the idea of child sacrifice may cause us to lump all these possibilities together. But anthropology asks us to separate them. A foundation sacrifice is different from a crisis sacrifice, which is utterly different from a ritualized burial for the already deceased. Each implies a different society, a different relationship with the gods, and a different frequency of action. By insisting on the single, terrifying word sacrifice, we risk missing the nuanced reality. We force a complex set of potential beliefs into a box labeled monstrous, and in doing so, we may silence the quieter, more tragic stories that the Urns have been trying to tell all along. The evidence refuses to settle into a single, comfortable truth. Instead, it forms a spectrum of possibilities, each shading into the next, where the clearest answer is that there is no single answer. Modern scholarship has largely moved away from the stark binary of monsters versus martyrs. The current landscape is one of nuanced, often conflicting, interpretations that force us to hold multiple truths at once. At one extreme end of this spectrum lies the traditional view, the one painted by Rome and echoed for centuries. This interpretation accepts the ancient accounts at face value. It posits that ritual child sacrifice was a systematic, institutionalized, and frequent practice in Carthage and other Punic cities. It was a grim pillar of state religion, a transaction with the gods woven into the fabric of society, where vows were made and lives, primarily of firstborn sons, were the accepted currency. The Tophet, in this view, is unequivocally the killing field. It earns the physical proof of a sustained horror. At the opposite end of the spectrum rests the revisionist cemetery theory. Here, the Phoenicians are absolved of the worst accusation. The Tophet is seen as a sacred burial ground, a separate and consecrated space for infants who died from the relentless natural causes of the ancient world. The fires were for cremation, the vows were prayers for protection in the afterlife, and the animal bones were companion gifts. The entire narrative of sacrifice is a catastrophic misunderstanding, a propaganda weapon forged by enemies who witnessed profound funeral rites and saw only barbarism. This theory reframes the Carthaginians not as perpetrators of evil, but as victims of slander, their profound grief weaponized against them for millennia. But most historians and archaeologists now find themselves somewhere in the vast, messy middle ground. This is where the spectrum holds its most plausible and perhaps most human complexities. In this middle zone, the truth is not one thing, but a combination of practices that shifted across time and location. It allows for the possibility that both sides of the debate have grasped a piece of the puzzle, but mistaken it for the whole picture. Perhaps the core function of the Tophet was indeed as a special cemetery for infants. This would explain the sheer demographic scale, the age profiles that sometimes match natural mortality, and the tender symbolism on the stelae. The majority of those small urns may very well hold children lost to tragedy, not to a blade. Yet, layered upon this baseline practice, there might have been moments of exceptional, ritualized killing. In times of existential crisis, a devastating plague, a brutal siege, a drought threatening the entire city, the community, gripped by collective panic, might have performed a desperate, one-time sacrificial rite. They might have offered what was most precious in a final, terrifying bargain with the gods for salvation. Such a rare, traumatic event would burn itself into cultural memory. It could provide the kernel of truth that enemies later seized upon and magnified into a defining characteristic. Furthermore, practices almost certainly varied from colony to colony. What was deemed necessary in the powerful, orthodox heart of Carthage may have been softened or transformed in a distant outpost like Monte Suri, where animal offerings appear to have been the overwhelming norm. The ritual could have evolved over centuries, starting one way and gradually shifting toward another, leaving a mixed archaeological record that reflects the change. So the spectrum asks us to accept a challenging, less satisfying conclusion. The Phoenicians of Carthage likely engaged in a complex set of rituals surrounding infant death. This probably included a standard, sacred burial practice for babies who died naturally, but it may have also included, on rare and terrifying occasions, the ritual killing of children during profound societal crises. And it almost certainly involved the sacrifice of young animals, either as substitutes, as companions, or as standard offerings in their own right. To insist on a single, blanket answer is to ignore the flexibility of human belief and the diversity of a far-flung civilization. The haunting field of urns does not whisper one secret but many, layered over each other like the ashes in the earth. The silence from Carthage is not an empty one, it is a resonant silence filled with echoes of what we can never truly hear. After all the carbon dating, the bone measurements, and the linguistic analysis, we are left standing at the edge of the Tophet, holding fragments that refuse to form a single, complete picture. The brutal truth is that we may never know for certain what happened in that sacred precinct. The evidence itself is the problem, a collection of clues that point in two opposite directions with equal, frustrating force. The charred bones of infants can be read as proof of a terrible ritual or as the heartbreaking signature of ancient infant mortality. The stone markers speak of vows but never of the price. The accounts of enemies are too poisoned by hatred to be trusted, yet too consistent to be entirely dismissed. This is not a puzzle missing one piece. It is a puzzle where the pieces belong to different boxes, and we have lost the lids that tell us which is which. The ambiguity is not a failure of modern scholarship. It is the inescapable condition of studying a civilization that was systematically erased. When the Roman legions finally broke through the walls of Carthage, they did more than burn a city. They enacted a cultural scorched earth policy. They slaughtered the population, sold the survivors into slavery, and methodically pulled the great metropolis apart, stone by stone, until nothing remained but foundations and memory. In that final, apocalyptic violence, they did not just kill a people, they murdered their story. The libraries, the temple archives, the personal letters, the priestly manuals, every first-hand account that could have explained the rituals of the Tophet, all of it went up in smoke or was carried off to be lost. We are trying to reconstruct a belief system from its physical shell after the soul has been utterly destroyed. This is why the mystery endures with such power. It taps into something far deeper than academic curiosity. It forces us to confront the most profound human taboos, the sacred boundaries of life and death, and the terrifying lengths to which faith or desperation might drive a society. It becomes a mirror for our own fears and judgments, but perhaps more importantly, it illustrates the fundamental limits of historical knowledge. We are accustomed to histories that give us answers, that tie events up with clear causes and effects. The story of Carthage refuses to do that. It presents us with a classic example of irreducible complexity, where the available evidence supports multiple, mutually exclusive narratives. Our desire for a clean verdict, for a simple label of monstrous or misunderstood, says more about our need for moral clarity than it does about the Carthaginians themselves. The lack of a definitive answer is not a hole in the historical record, it is the record. It teaches us that some pasts are fundamentally unrecoverable, lost in the fires of conquest and time. And in that loss, we learn to sit with uncertainty, to weigh probabilities instead of certainties, and to understand that sometimes the most honest history is the one that acknowledges the shadows are just as real as the light. The legend of blood on the altar endures not because it has been proven, but because it lives in that fertile, unsettling space between what might have been and what we can never truly know. Our journey through this mystery has taken us from the shocking accusations of ancient enemies to the silent, dusty urns of Carthage itself. We have seen how the story was shaped, first by Roman propaganda seeking to justify a genocide, and then by archaeologists who believed they had found its terrible proof. We have followed the evidence as it fractured into a scholarly civil war, with each new discovery seeming to support both sides at once. The bones whisper of both natural tragedy and deliberate selection. The stones speak of vows but never of violence. The sheer scale of the Tophet argues against systematic killing, yet its very existence feels like a grim confirmation. We are left holding two competing truths. One paints the Phoenicians as a people capable of a horrific, institutionalized ritual, offering their children to appease gods of stone and bronze. The other reveals a sophisticated civilization tragically familiar with infant loss, creating a sacred space to mourn their smallest children under the protection of their deities. To choose one narrative absolutely is to ignore the compelling weight of the other. This ambiguity is the final and perhaps most important lesson of Carthage. The Phoenicians were not one-dimensional monsters, nor were they simply misunderstood victims of slander. They were a complex, brilliant, and deeply human civilization. They gave us the alphabet, they mapped the Mediterranean, and they built a commercial network that connected the ancient world. To reduce their entire legacy to the single, unresolved question of blood on the altar does them a profound disservice. It simplifies their story into a moral fable and steals their true, multifaceted humanity. So what are we left with? The legend of child sacrifice endures not because it has been proven, but because it lives in that haunting space between evidence and interpretation, between ancient hatred and modern judgment. The blood on the altar may be as much a stain of propaganda and our own dark fascination as it is a historical reality. The mystery remains, and perhaps it always will. But now you have the tools to weigh it for yourself. Look at the sources, consider the bones, and listen to the silence of the Phoenicians' own lost words. Then decide what you believe happened in that field of stone markers so long ago. We would love to hear your conclusions in the comments below. What does the evidence tell you?